Okay, welcome everybody. It is a great pleasure and indeed a privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Thomas Maissen. Before I say a few words by way of introduction in behalf of the History Department and the Urban Humanities Initiative, I'd like to extend my warm thanks to the co-sponsors of tonight's event, namely the Medieval and Renaissance Center, as well as the Department of German. In particular, I'd like to thank Professors Apun. Unfortunately, Carl can't be here tonight because of a medical situation, and Professor Wood from the German department for their support in the planning of this event. Now, about tonight's speaker. Thomas Maissen is the director of the German Historical Institute in Paris. Not all of you may know this institute, located in a beautiful 17th century palais in the heart of Paris. So perhaps I should explain that the German Historical Institute is not an institute of German history, but rather a research institute that is funded by the Federal Republic of Germany and dedicated to a wide range of historical research spanning from the Middle Ages to modern staff. To modern times. And there's a staff of 40, right? You told me last night, 40 researchers, administrative staff as well, who help Thomas Maissen to run this institute, of which he has been a director since 2013, and he's recently been re-elected for a second term. Before moving to Paris, he held, and nominally still holds, the chair of early modern history at the University of Heidelberg. Maissen describes his main research interests as the history of political thought, the history of religion and mentalities, and historical iconography. His publications include 11 monographs, 5 edited volumes, and more than 120 research articles. He's a member of various scientific boards, including the executive board of the prestigious Balzan Prize, and he also serves as editor of 4 book series. Thomas Maissen studied history, Latin, and philosophy in Basel, Rome, Naples, and Paris. He earned his PhD from the University of Basel in Switzerland in 1993. And indeed, Thomas Maissen is Swiss. That is something that you might not think is important to know, but I can assure you that it is known to every newspaper-reading person in Switzerland. In fact, it is no exaggeration to say that Maissen is one of the foremost public intellectuals in Switzerland. Now, admittedly, Switzerland is not a country that often makes the headlines in US news, but it is nonetheless a country where things are happening. I mean things other than trains being notoriously on time. In fact, Switzerland, despite its prosperity and almost unrivaled quality of life, has seen, especially in recent years, a phenomenon that we observe in many Western liberal democracies, namely a growing turn against the ideals of an open society. And this is reflected, for instance, by the rise of a right-wing political party and the disparaging of the liberal media. This tendency goes hand in hand with a re-mystification of the past, a past that is depicted as the good old times when everything was in order. Thomas Maissen has been one of the most vocal critics of this abuse of history, and he has tirelessly worked to debunk the myth of a rosy Swiss past marked by splendid isolation. Instead, he has shown how Swiss history has always been embedded in the general history of Europe, with all the good and bad sides that entails. He has done so by exploring a wide chronological and thematic spectrum. This includes a volume on Switzerland's role in the confiscation of Jewish assets during World War II. But of course, his home turf is the early modern period, a period that saw the succession of the Swiss Confederation from the Holy Roman Empire. This birth of the Republic, he shows, was a far more complex process than historians of an older generation have often admitted. And in his magisterial 2006 book, The Birth of the Republic, Concept and Representation of the State in Early Modern Switzerland, Maissen emphasizes the ambiguities and tensions that marked Swiss republicanism for a long time. His more recent History of Switzerland, and now available in the 5th edition and translated into several European languages, presents a comprehensive and eminently readable account of Swiss history from its earliest days to our time. But Switzerland and its history is only one area of Maissen's manifold research interests, and in recent years some of his publications display an increasing interest in global history as well. I would just like to mention his forthcoming volume, Why China Did Not Have a Renaissance and Why That Matters, co-edited with the sinologist Barbara Mittler. Also under Maissen's directorship, the German Historical Institute has started collaborative projects in Senegal. Maissen himself is a scholar at home in many different academic settings, including here in the States, where he has spent time as a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. It is also our good fortune that he regularly visits the German Historical Institute in Washington, as this provided us with the opportunity to bring him here to NYU. And the lecture he will give to us tonight is titled From Cities to Princes, Religious Choice in the Age of the Reformation. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for this introduction, which was, of course, much too kind and too modest in the same time, because Daniel forgot maybe what was the most important step in my teaching career in Heidelberg. The person who spoke to you was my student for some years, and I'm, of course, you can imagine, very proud that it's he who invites me to NYU to speak to you. And with the big pleasure, I will try to introduce you into the world of the Reformation under the particular aspect of choice, religious choice, as you can see from my title. In 1516, the 16-year-old Prince, Habsburg Prince Charles of Burgundy, inherited the crowns of Castile-Leon and Aragon and bore now the Spanish title Carlos I. As a successor of his paternal grandfather, Maximilian I, he also became Charles V and King of the Holy Roman Empire in 1519 and its Emperor in 1530. His life during, he fought the Italian wars that had begun in 1494 already. In those wars, a system of princely states was taking shape. If powerful mercantile city-states like Florence and Venice had been dominant during the 15th century, national monarchies, and namely Spain and France, clearly took over the reins of power in international relations and fought for hegemony. Only the monarchies could mobilize the military and economic resources to wage war beyond their own borders for decades on end. In the case of Charles V's Spain, the development of a national monarchy took place in an empire, which was a colonial empire, which you can see here, on which the sun never set. It's the yellow and red areas which belong to the Habsburg monarchy dynasty and to Charles V. Although the Holy Roman Empire had officially carried the qualifier of the German nation as part of its name since 1512, the empire, in contrast to England or France or Spain itself, was still thought to have claim to occidental, indeed universal authority. Holding this multilingual composite empire together was a Herculean task. Charles' composite monarchy comprised 27 kingdoms, 13 grand duchies, 22 earldoms, 9 baronies, and so on. Each had its own legal code and its own administrative apparatus. The only linking institution was the church, and only the church could provide a common ideology, as we would call it nowadays. Like the empire, the church claimed to be universal and was rooted in the tradition of ancient Rome. Throughout his life, Charles sought to cooperate with the papacy, above all in fighting against the Ottoman Turks and the Protestant heretics. In Spain, which was actually not one kingdom, but the two distinct kingdoms of Castile y León and Aragon, a national church had come into being during the reign of Charles' grandparents Ferdinand and Isabella. The crown was allowed to appoint bishops, to limit the authority of ecclesiastical courts, and to discipline clergy. Moreover, in many places it collected tithes and other revenues, which thus did not end up in the hands of the curia, and instead provided about a fifth of the state's income. The crown could draw on the institution of the church that spanned Christendom in governing its not yet unified lands. Its clergy could also carry out worldly administrative tasks. Religious unity was also maintained by the notorious Inquisition, a special court that was, unlike in medieval times, a state rather than an ecclesiastical institution in Spain. Indeed, it was the only institution that encompassed the whole of Spain. As in Spain, a national church also developed in France during the 15th century. The Gallican Church was orthodox in dogma, but as a result of the 1516 Concordat of Bologna, the French king had considerable say in ecclesiastical appointments. This crown-controlled ecclesiastical order was an indispensable foundation of modern state building. Now the decisive question was, would Charles V be able to establish such an order in the empire as well as he had inherited in Spain? Charles traveled to Germany for the first time in 1520. There we are. The occasion was his coronation in Aachen. From there he continued on to the Diet of Worms. Among the topics on the Diet's agenda was an Augustinian monk who had been causing trouble in Germany for a couple of years already. The Curia under the Medici Pope, Leo X, had already summoned Martin Luther to Rome to stand trial for heresy. Luther's ruler, Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony, kept him from going to Rome and thus saved him from execution, the fate that had befallen Jan Hus a century earlier. Frederick, a great collector of sacred relics, was not a firm follower of Luther's new teachings, but he did not want to jeopardize the recently founded university in Wittenberg. Actually, Luther had taken up two theological issues that had already been intensively debated for decades: the paramount authority of the Bible and the doctrine of justification. But these ideas first became explosive with Luther's unequivocal emphasis: sola gratia, sola fide, sola scriptura, solo Christo. Only through God's grace, only through faith, only through Holy Scripture, and through the intermission of the Christ only are we saved. No human works, not the institutional church or its traditions, and even less indulgences play a role if the sovereign God decides on salvation and damnation. This theological position had precursors, but Luther was the first person to draw the conclusion that salvation was not to be found through the existing church, if it remained as it was. And responsibility for that state of affairs ultimately rested with the Pope and the Curia, who wanted nothing to change. If they rejected the truths that Luther had derived from his reading of Scripture, they must be acting contrary to their own better knowledge. As Luther came to this realization, he and his opponents alike quickly formulated their theological positions. Positions that were, as the Lutheran pamphlet put it in characteristically radical terms in 1522, so far from each other as heaven and earth, summer and winter, God and the devil. For those of you among you who are studying German, I have these original quotations, but don't be afraid, you will always get the translation in English, into English. Already in his 1520 treatise to the Christian nobility of the German nation, Luther identified the Pope with the Antichrist, 3 years after the start of the Reformation, so very early. The dichotomies of biblical imagery, salvation and damnation, this life and the next, Christ and Antichrist, structured an eschatological confrontation. This Protestant pamphlet of 1524 sums this up as a confrontation of the new church and the old. And you can very easily see the opposition, the new church to the... You can see if it does work. No, I show it. So here is dividing line. To the left you have the new church. Door is open for Christ. On the right side it's the old church, so the door is obviously closed because Christ is hidden. On the other side you have the devil who opens the door, on the Catholic side, so to say, while on the Protestant side the devil cannot enter the door below. How did Luther respond to the understandable accusation that his dichotomizing message aroused division, danger, and discord? Let us now come back to the Diet of Worms and to Luther's famous speech before Charles V on April 18, 1521. Luther replied indeed that this division was most welcome to him, for partisanship and discord had arisen from God's words, as he, the Christ, and now he's quoting Gospel, as he said, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. This was a quotation from Matthew 10, and Luther went on quoting the next verses, 34, 35. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. A man's enemies will be members of his own household. In his 1527 commentary, sorry for missing the, there we are. In his 1527 commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, Luther went so far as to say that it was the nature and the manner of the Gospel to bring along uproar and discord, disagreement and persecution. With that citation, Luther fell back on a particularity of Christian belief. You have here the full quotation in modern English. A particularity of Christian belief that sets Christianity apart from other religions. In both theory and practice, other faiths are passed on by birth, that is, from a person's father and his mother. By contrast, one becomes a Christian by choosing to do so. That is the reason why baptism is corroborated by First Communion or confirmation. The principle of individual choice explains why adult baptism found so many adherents in the Reformation era. The specifically Christian understanding of conversion and mission also received a decisive new impulse at that time that likewise went back to the Pauline principle that religious membership rests upon choice. As Luther's quotation from Matthew suggests, this individual choice can, and if necessary must, put a person at odds with his own kin. that could be deadly in pre-modern times. Who but the extended family was there to provide physical and material security in a society without police or a welfare state? Indeed, the Christian choice obliges the believer to resist even political or religious leaders who deviate from the path of truth. Since, now the big question is how to get back. Previous, that's probably a good thing to do. And again. Sorry for. That's the fight between Apple and PC. Wow. Okay, I think I just go on, and we will. No, it's too far. Who of you is an Apple user? That would be great. Just go back. So you get the whole presentation in 2 minutes.
The mouse does not have any buttons on it.
There's something on the side here, which is.
I think it's just for show. This is. Wait, maybe.
That's always a good idea. We start again.
Yeah. But maybe using the arrow keys will help.
So, thanks. And one more. Here we are. That's what I wanted to say. We must obey God more than man, or we should obey more PC than Macintosh, if you ask me. But here we are. That's the famous quotation, which was quoted very often in the Reformation times. So the seed of individual disobedience is thus as much a part of Christianity as the trusted symbols of the decision for Christianity, baptism and the Lord's Supper. In the Reformation, the place of family and secular rulers as the guides of that decision was taken by the individual conscience. Luther was the one who put the word Gewissen in German, conscience, at the center of his teaching. His famous response to Charles V at the Diet of Worms, coming back to that in 1521, is again relevant. I am convicted by the scripture, which I have quoted, and my conscience is kept captive to the word of God. Therefore, I cannot and will not recant, since it is difficult, unprofitable, and dangerous indeed to do anything against one's conscience. God help me, amen. That's the end of this text that became very famous, especially in Germany. Luther's conscience was captive to the word of God, and thus not autonomous, an autonomous conscience in the modern sense of the term. It is a ruled conscience, a conscience first ruled by the sinner's fear of the Old Testament God of the law, and then by the liberating faith of the justified in the New Testament God of grace. This was at least the emancipating message that Luther wanted to be diffused among all Christians. But it was precisely there where this true path to salvation ought to be preached that Luther encountered resistance, namely in the church, from theologically trained clergy. For that reason, he did not want them to be entrusted any longer with decisions about true doctrine. Instead, lay people had to decide by following their conscience and not following, or not only following, theological textbooks or theologisms. In 1520 already, Luther's treatise, which I already mentioned, To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, spelled out his doctrine of the priesthood of all believers in order to justify the intervention of that nobility, it is the German princes, in the conflict with the church. This became the foundation of some episcopacy, the Lutheran principle that the earthly authority assume the position of the supreme governor of the state church. Elector Frederick the Wise consequently insisted in November 1520 that Luther be brought before a tribunal of impartial scholars rather than be tried for heresy, as the Curia had wanted. With this revolutionary demand, the elector made the Curia a party on equal footing with Luther that had to accept the ruling of a superior arbiter in matters of doctrine. Frederick the Wise treated the case of Luther and the papal bull, which was actually already a death sentence, not as an authoritative decision on doctrine, but rather as only legal conflict with the Curia. Thus, the Reichstag and the imperial law became more important than the Curia and canon law. The imperial estates would then demand at the 1526 meeting of the Reichstag in Speyer that they would live, govern, and behave the way each one of them could account for against God and the imperial majesty, and thus until a council of the church was called. At least temporarily, the conscience of the ruler, and these are now the princes of the empire and the estates of the empire, their accountability to God would be decisive for the Reformation. With few exceptions, such as Frederick the Wise, whom I mentioned, the rulers in the Protestant camp that was gradually taking shape were, however, not princes, but rather the councils of imperial cities, such as Nuremberg, Strasbourg, Zurich, or Ulm. Luther's teaching had quickly found a receptive audience among the middle-class residents of such cities. Literate craftsmen and merchants were accustomed to being held accountable in their business dealings and expected accountability from others. They also demanded it of the church, to which they paid contributions. To these educated urban citizens, it was obvious to take the Bible as the sole means of access to the salvation and to correct doctrine. It was exactly the burghers in this social milieu who faced the decision of a Christian. Should they follow the reformers or abide by the faith of their fathers? This was an individual but also a collective question. How could the conscience of a community or even of a whole city be expressed? How were they to carry through the choice between God and Satan? Here too, secular authorities did not simply leave a question touching upon salvation to the theological experts. Rather, they dealt with the question of conscience in a framework that they themselves established: public colloquies on matters of faith. The first two public colloquies at all took place in Zurich in 1523. The city council summoned clergy to the city hall and not to a church, in order to address disputed issues in the German tongue and language, as it was openly declared. In the opinion of Zurich's reformer Ulrich Zwingli, not only the clergy, but also all the other pious people could and should understand the word of God. The actual point of the proceedings invented by Zwingli and of the tradition that grew from them was to make a choice. Many cities followed the Zurich communal model of religious colloquy. Nuremberg in 1525, Bern and Hamburg in 1528, Ulm in 1530, Esslingen in 1531, and so on. Only later, the imperial princes held colloquies of their own. The public religious colloquy was somewhat different from the traditional academic disputation, which you might know in nowadays terms, the traditional academic translation that was conducted in Latin, in which scholars would cite authoritative writers and texts in setting out their positions. The public colloquy was conducted in the vernacular, and the Bible was not just one among multiple sources for deciding matters of doctrine, as in the academic disputation. It became the one decisive authority, sola scriptura, for deciding whether and how the earthly church had to be rebuilt. The colloquy's ultimate goal was to resolve conflict within the community and within the framework of some episcopacy, which in the city belonged to the burgomaster and councils. Regardless whether the decision went for or against the Reformation, the rulers who decided to organize public religious colloquies in effect already adopted the principle of some episcopacy and the priesthood of all believers also in deciding questions of doctrine. The colloquy staged by the city of Bern in 1528, which you can see here a later image, is a typical example. City leaders expressly stated that the only authority the opposing parties would be allowed to cite in defending their positions would be the Bible. The point of reference, in other words, was a text that in principle was accessible to lay people and certainly more readily accessible than the theological tradition of the established church. Reformers appeared before secular judges not as accused heretics, but as a priori equals of the representatives of orthodoxy. The decision which of the parties was right, the decision, in other words, of the true path to salvation, no longer rested with theologians, or at least not with theologians alone. It rested instead with the community, both political and religious. Some 600 people, above all lay people, turned out for the first Zurich colloquy, 900 for the second. In places where it was not the city council alone that decided against or more commonly for religious reform, the decision would be put to a popular vote. Of Esslingen's 7,500 residents, for example, 1,076 men were eligible to vote, nearly all citizens who belonged to guilds after women, minors, members of the lower classes, and non-citizens were subtracted. A small minority of 21 voters expressed their opposition to the Reformation. In Ulm in 1530, the common man, that's how he was called, decided whether he wanted to accept the emperor's decision against the Reformation. The dilemma was presented as a choice between, on the one hand, one's own consciousness, Eigenkonscienz und Gewissen, with regard to the salvation of the soul, and on the other hand, the obedience towards Charles V, the imperial lord of the city who threatened with the most severe reprisals. Of the 1,865 guild members, 87% voted against the imperial decision, which means that they were in favor of the new faith. The voting lists divide the camps into followers of the new evangelical doctrine as opposed to the old popish opinion. So you have this dichotomy in the lists themselves. The lists also show that different votes were cast from members of one same family, which means that individual choices were made. The decision for or against the Reformation unfolds before readers' eyes in a broadside of 1529, engraved by the Protestant artist Georg Pent. You might have already seen this image, the announcement of my lecture. On the left stand an evangelical priester, and on the right the Papists, a group of Catholic following some clerics and others just listening to the priest. The clerics defend their position, which, among other reasons, the argument that believers should continue in the tradition of their forebears who had not been fools after all. Unsere alten die auch nicht sind gewesen Narren. So the tradition is explained through the importance of the tradition is explained in the text of the famous author Hans Sachs, who takes the side of the Reformation. And he goes on, or he ends with the demand for the decision. Now you decide, pious Christian, which teaching is true, after reading what has been explained. Hierin urteil du frommer Christ, welche Lehre die wahrhaft ist. For that reason, not only supporters of the new teachings, but also many representatives of the established church favored public religious colloquies. A particularly clear example comes from the three leagues in the Grisons in nowadays Switzerland that opposed the Bishop of Chur's claim to secular political authority and thereby set the rules how largely autonomous communities would decide matters of faith. The so-called Articles of Alliance were adopted in 1524 and 26 and abolished the rule of the Bishop of Chur. They gave secular authorities responsibility for church property and the free choice of clergy. Although those sound like typically Protestant demands, the Articles of Alliance determined only the procedure for making a decision and did not tip the scales in favor of reform. Citizens selected their clergy and thus their faith by the principle of majority rule in their communities. The canton of Graubünden became a patchwork quilt of Protestant and Catholic parishes, all of which were in principle confessionally homogeneous, but just on the level of the community. The search for a new, unambiguous source of truth was thus not a solely urban phenomenon, but as in the Grisons encompassed the countryside as well. When the common man rose up in the famous Peasants' War of 1525, strikingly, the first demand in the peasants' famous 12 Articles was for congregational election of pastors. Like the citizens of towns and cities, peasants wanted a say on clerical appointments at the village level and the care of souls. Concluding their demands, the rebellious peasants insisted that they be taught on the basis of Holy Scripture whether one of their propositions was not in line with the Word of God. Here, too, we see the impact of the Reformation principle of the primacy of the Bible. Indeed, Luther's 1524 text to the councillors of all cities in Germany that they should establish and maintain Christian schools had made clear that the responsibility of secular authorities in religious matter, it was called the Cura Religionis Christiani Magistratus, had to be expanded. That responsibility was now to include the supervision and financing of education and the care of souls. That gave rise to a new literary genre, the catechism, beginning with Luther's German Catechism of 1529. The catechism conveyed religious knowledge and religious truth in the vernacular. The text was not simply to be recited or memorized, it was to be understood. The Christian's choice was to be grounded in the knowledge of what that decision really meant to him. There was widespread need for such a mission because the Latin Mass was much more remote to Christian lay people than it was to their counterparts who spoke Romance languages. With Luther's use of the vernacular for preaching and for the Bible translation, Protestant Christianity came to be understood as a national matter. Although for Luther, the fight against indulgences was a theological, not a fiscal issue, this contributed to such an understanding. Since the time of the church councils of the 15th century, compilations of German complaints, the so-called Gravamina der deutschen Nation, had attacked the curious taxes, the sales of indulgences, and the sale of ecclesiastical offices to the highest bidder. Many Germans hoped that the outward flow of money and the filling of church offices by foreigners could be stopped by the establishment of an autonomous national church similar to those in France or in Spain, but of Protestant creed in this case. Charles V could continue the national church tradition in his Spanish territories in his capacity as King Carlos I. But as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, he was not able to establish such a church across the whole of Germany because this would have had to be a Protestant national church. Charles' refusal of the Protestant faith resulted in a competition about who could create an alternative to a national church at the imperial level, and this meant territorial churches at the level of the imperial estates. The rebellious peasants were not able to achieve that, and neither were the imperial knights guided by Franz von Sickingen against the Archbishop of Trier in 1522, an episode I can just evoke. The imperial princes violently suppressed both the knights' revolts and the peasants' war, and thereby eliminated two groups among the imperial estates from the struggle for political influence and self-determination. The cities, by contrast, were initially successful in that struggle, particularly those that were able to emancipate themselves from the rule of bishops or abbots, as, for example, Augsburg, Strasbourg, and Basel managed to do. These were indeed cases of communal reformation, of collective decision-making, and often on the basis of public colloquies moderated by city councils. But the cities also lost their individual and collective power after they had to surrender to Charles V, who won the war against the Protestant Schmalkaldic League in 1546 and 47. The emperor then made a last attempt to impose religious unity in the empire in 1548 with a decree known as the Augsburg Interim. Tellingly, Charles failed, not only because of military resistance from the Protestant princes, but also because of reservations on the part of Catholic rulers, including the own Austrian branch of his own dynasty. All of the imperial estates feared brutish Spanish servitude, as they called it then. Brutish Spanish servitude. All feared the end of their liberties under the imperial constitution if Charles succeeded to turn a religiously unified empire over to his son and successor in Spain, Philip II. Charles eventually agreed that the imperial title went to his brother Ferdinand when he abdicated in 1556, a singular event in the history of the empire. Ferdinand dealt with the Protestants not as rebellious heretics, but as negotiating partners. That contributed decisively to the frustration felt by Charles, who had always seen himself as the ruler of a universal empire with one universal faith. As to Ferdinand, symptomatically, his first and most important achievement was the 1555 religious peace of Augsburg with the Protestants. That peace agreement established the so-called jus reformandi, the right of secular rulers to initiate religious reform. This corresponds, of course, also the right not to do it, so to have the decision about it. This corresponds to the popular reformulation as cuius regio eius religio. He who owns the territory imposes his religious faith. That right established once and for all that in the empire the issue of religious reform would be decided on a territorial basis, on the territory of the individual imperial states. Subjects had to accept the faith of their ruler or emigrate. The freedom of choice for the many that had made possible the Reformation became the freedom to choose of just one individual conscience, the conscience of the ruler. Both the princely Reformation and the princely counter-Reformation took place on the territorial level within the empire, not on the, so to say, national level of the empire of the German nation. The religious peace of Augsburg of 1555 was an acknowledgement that religious unity could not be re-established in the empire. Unity was to be enforced instead at the territorial level, in other words, individually in each of the empire's approximately 400 constituent territories. The empire became the confessional patchwork you can see here, which both mirrored and justified the federal character of the empire and Germany alike, and this somehow until nowadays. In pre-modern times, it was not language or ethnicity or ideology that provided the foundation of political community and belonging, but rather religion, a shared religion. The religious peace of Augsburg gave strong impetus to a process that was already underway, a process historians now call confessionalization, which is often discussed and can be discussed. I just hinted it. Confessionalization rested on training clergy and lay people in an unifying orthodoxy and visitations by the authorities to ensure that a proper doctrine was being taught at the parish level. The imperial princes thereby discovered the defense of the true faith as a means to legitimize their supplanting of the emperors and the popes' universal powers of decision within their own states and territorial churches. The defense of the true faith allowed Protestant rulers and, to a lesser extent, also their Catholic counterparts to lay claim to church property. Territorial churches emerged across Germany, but not a German national church. Outside of Germany, however, Protestants did succeed in building national churches. The marital problems of England's notorious Henry VIII with his 6 wives did not center on religious differences. At issue was rather the primacy of the secular ruler in the Anglican Church that Henry established when the Pope refused his request for divorce. The 1534 Act of Supremacy created an English national church with Henry as its spiritual and worldly leader, a position English monarchs have held ever since, as you know. Henry's Samepiscopacy or Caesaropapism did not take an unambiguously Protestant direction in theology until the reign of his daughter Elizabeth I. Following the collapse of the loose union of Sweden and Denmark, the usurpers Gustavus I and Frederick I established national churches with only limited popular support in order to bolster their fragile holds on power. It was of decisive importance that the 2 kings were able to name bishops and archbishops and, as in England, to bind crown and clergy by means of an oath of obedience. The opportunistic decision that the usurpers took in religious doctrine became a matter of national importance because printing was introduced only in this context in Scandinavia and diffused the Bible in the vernacular. The New Testament was published in Danish in 1524 and the entire Bible in 1550. Swedish and Finnish Bible translations appeared in 1541 and 1548, respectively. East Central Europe developed in a different direction. Structurally similar to the empire, the region did not give rise to a dominant monarchy. Instead, the upper nobility, which you could compare to the princes in the Holy Roman Empire, the upper nobility adopted the principle of cuius regio, eius religio for itself. Their vassals and serfs were thus obliged to adopt their religious faith. The ruling nobles of Hungary, Poland and Transylvania did not limit their confessional decisions to a choice between Lutheranism and Catholicism. Some opted for the Calvinist Reformed faith, and a few even became anti-Trinitarians who rejected the doctrine of the Trinity as biblically unfounded. It would be a mistake to understand that coexistence, which you can see here very well, where you have different colors, of the Protestant, Calvinist usually, and Catholic and Lutheran living together. So that's not toleration in the modern sense of the term. Coexistence rested on the fact that noble rulers did not want to infringe on the political and religious prerogatives of other rulers that they claimed for themselves. The prerequisite for and guarantee of bi- and multi-confessional cohabitation was a strong representative body of a territory's estates. In monoconfessional countries, especially in France, in Spain, and in Austria, representative bodies were under great pressure and had lost much of their power. By contrast, the imperial diet, or the Reichstag, the diet of the Swiss communes, the general estates of the Dutch provinces, the Polish Sejm, the Hungarian and Transylvanian diets, and a little later, in a under different circumstances, the English Parliament. In all these bodies, representatives of the estates were able to defend their traditional privileges as well as their newly won religious freedom, often in confessional opposition to the princes. Autonomy meant religious freedom of these elites, and this meant control of the local church, of the clergy and ecclesiastical property, and that was a necessary prerequisite for the construction of a modern state. It is no coincidence that the Reformed Church emerged as the third major confession in this situation. It developed from the union of the two Swiss Reformed churches, the German-speaking movement initiated by Ulrich Zwingli, and the French-speaking movement led by Jean Calvin. Unlike the Zwinglians and in particular the Lutherans, Calvin envisioned a congregational church that was not necessarily subordinate to secular authorities or tightly integrated within an episcopal or synodal ecclesiastical order. Calvinism owed its international influence above all to its exercise of congregational autonomy that could resist to Catholic rulers in the Spanish Netherlands, famous case in Hungary, and the other Habsburg possessions, and not least in Calvin's native land in France itself. As a principle, cuius regio, eius religio, became established across Europe on different political levels, religion, or rather confession, was once again transmitted by birth from parent to child. After a temporary period of openness during the Reformation, the free decision envisioned in Matthew 10:35, that is, the decision against the faith of one's closest relatives and parents, once again became a life-threatening choice for religious outsiders. At least the jus emigrandi established by the religious peace of Augsburg allowed them to follow the dictates of conscience and to seek refuge elsewhere. Given the division of the empire into many small units, they often did not need to travel far. Long-term territorial solutions, such as that in the empire, were not possible by contrast in England, France, and Spain, with their national monarchies and national churches. There, evangelicals, Huguenots, and dissenters, like on the other side, Catholics in Protestant lands, made a decision of conscience that could lead to resistance and tyrannicide. The Christian potential of choice and the decision for the true God was realized during the Reformation on an exceptional basis. Because of the autonomy that the structure of the empire granted them, urban officials in particular were able to make their individual religious decisions. Regardless whether they adhered to the Catholic, to the Lutheran, or to the Reformed version of Christianity, the integrative Western institutional church, with its universalistic claim, came to an end. The church became a means of unifying and demarcating particular states. Ideally, confession, territory, and dynastic identity coincided. The decisions first of city dwellers and then of princes in favor of the Reformation laid the foundations to adapt ecclesiastical structures to the system of sovereign states. It was that state system, reflecting the growth of national diversities, that ultimately deprived the Pope and the Emperor of their claims to universal authority and limited their rule to the territories they owned personally. Thank you very much.
So we have time for questions. Raise your hand.
I noticed in that image, there are preachers on both sides, but not a sacramental side and a preaching side. Is that unusual that the Catholic Church would be seen as non-sacramental but preaching?
Well, I didn't look at it that way, but I was always surprised that it's compared to for example, the pamphlet I showed you, where you had the door open to devil and then door closed to devil. This pamphlet is quite, what would you say, ambiguous. So it's not. If you look at it first, it's not clear who are the good ones and who are the bad ones. So,
yes.
You have, if you look closer, you have the
Rosaries.
The rosaries, exactly, which make it very clear, of course, and it hints at popular religious acts. But it is exceptional in that sense that usually that would be one of the main differences, and which would be shown because everybody, especially people who do not read, who will not read the text, they would understand very easily. So here, if you do not read the text, you might be hesitating where to go. So it is obviously to the texts which are quite also the text. So here you have Summa des päpstlichen Predigers. It's really the Pope is the priest who is speaking, and here you have the Protestant minister who is speaking, and you have these two positions which are presented in a more or less neutral way, and in the end, then the invitation to decide between the two. So it is for a very erudite or well informed readers already.
Thank you.
Should I just?
I apologize if this seems a bit unrelated, but I just want to note that any day now the Chinese government is supposed to come to an agreement with the papacy over the selection of bishops within the state of China, because both the papacy and the Chinese state have each been selecting separate bishops for the same parishes. Sometimes they don't even recognize one another. And I was wondering if this is a situation that you've been looking at to see for any parallels in the development of early modern states and the selection of clergy.
I haven't, but I can give it a thought if you, in the sense that it shows that the challenge is on two levels, and I think in China might be even a third level, because it's about materialist state ideology, which is against religion in general. In the case of France, more than Spain, you can see very clearly that for the king it really matters that the state, the crown, not the state, the crown controls the nomination of the bishops for real political reasons. These are very influential positions. And the church is somehow in the late 15th and in the early 16th century still the only institution which is present all over the territory. There are no public servants, in a village or in a small city. They always have to be sent there, while there would always be a priest. And so it's very important to control the church in order to control the flock through the church. That can be a very tough fight, and it was until this Concordat of 1516, especially in the 15th century. It was a tough fight between the French kings and the Catholic Church, which had nothing to do with doctrine. So it was very clear, and it was even important for the French kings, because they considered themselves to be protectors, or the Rex Christianissimus, which is the most Christian king. The title depending, of course, from the fact that he would protect the Christian and then the Catholic Church. So not at all the idea of opposing the Church on any doctrinal matters, Even that's later the case in the 17th century when the Jansenist movement in France becomes very strong. The king is very strongly in favor of the Catholic orthodoxy against this movement, so he doesn't use it against the church, but he wants to get hold of the structure and of the hierarchy. And in the same time, the Catholic Church, thanks to this autonomy, which is much bigger than the Protestant churches will have it, that's what I try to show, that they become or more or less state churches on the level of a national state or on the level of state like Prussia or Bavaria, it's not Catholic, but Saxony and so on, or even of a small city. Zurich would have until today has its own national church, if you want to call it that way, its own state church. The Catholic churches always keep more autonomy, can keep more autonomy, thanks to the fact that there is a Pope in Rome, and the Chinese have somehow to deal also with this Pope in Rome. Well, they have to. For a long time they didn't. But it's in their shared interest that the Pope in Rome and the Chinese government find a solution, because they both agree on the fact that it's not welcome to have strife within these parishes in China, probably, instead of somehow getting better along together. So that I'm not sure whether that's really a very let's say significant to the situation in China, what I just said, but that would be the parallel to my understanding. You first, then.
So I thought it was interesting, like how this period of openness ended. If the colloquy was like a necessary product of the Protestant ideology, then how do you explain that period kind of coming to an end? And is it the idea that like once you put your name on the list, then that's set in stone? Because doesn't that go against the idea of constantly like questioning what we're doing?
Yeah, that's a good point, or an important point. And it matters a lot. I would not say that it's part of the Protestant ideology or of the Protestant message. My point was to say that's Christian, and that distinguish Christianity from other religions, which does not say that it's better or not. It's just this potential insistence on choice is something particularly Christian. Now, as you all know from history, and most of us from our own experience, we are not asked when we are 3 years old, do you want to become Catholic or whatever you are. So we all usually are in the faith of our parents. That is what happens normally. My interest was exactly in this situation. How does it come that in a particular context the potential is made true or is used again? And I would insist on the fact that it's not necessarily, it doesn't lead necessarily to the Protestant choice. A choice means really that you can say either or even choose between three possibilities, which is exceptional. Because usually it's easier to go on. You stick to the tradition of your parents. You do not want to change your faith if everybody in the same village or in the same city has these convictions. So there are many reasons not to change, and you don't very often you don't know about alternatives also. I mean, now I'm speaking about medieval and early modern times. It's not about nowadays when you can get a lot of information about, nowadays you have, especially you in the US, but everywhere we have a religious market with many offerings. In this time, the religious market, an open religious market, was exceptional. And that's what the fact what I'm looking at. What does if the the reasons which are often given for the success, the partial success of the Protestant movement, the Reformation movement, they should explain that all the cities in Germany at least, and also those in France and elsewhere, should have become Protestant. Because people say, well, you know, they are merchants, they like to read, they are humanistically trained, printing is very important. Well, there was book printing in Cologne, there were merchants in Cologne. Cologne was a big city. Cologne remained Catholic. So it's not enough to understand why there was some success for the Reformation. It's also important to understand why in the same social structure others decided to remain loyal to the existing church. And I think this focus on choice allows us to understand that there is a particular moment in which this could be done in the particular situation of the German cities. And here I think the structure of the empire is much more important than, let us say, the social or only the social background of the cities. Where else do you have almost completely autonomous cities, and a big number of them, which communicate among each other, where what is said or printed in one city is known in the next city a few days later, and where a city, if the city decides to its own, takes a religious decision, it can defend it also against. Not all of them could, but most cities, once they had this opted for Protestantism, they defended it. Although I mentioned this Schmalkaldic War, which was a political moment of real problem when they lost against the emperor. They lost their political power, but they didn't have to change. So it was not clear immediately, but after 10 years, one could say, they, besides Constance, that's the only real exception, they all could keep their Protestant faith. And but they were no longer, and they had no longer an interest in reintroducing this moment of decision. I would say nobody had an interest, because the social network and the social coherence depended on homogeneity, and so everybody agreed. What everybody hated most was not so much Catholicism or Protestantism, but the mixture, because how can you live together? Now I take a Catholic side. How can you live in the same city as a Catholic with a Protestant, who will probably tell you, well, I will pay you back my debt of 500 guilders next week, and you know, when he believes in another God than you do, and if he makes an oath, it's very certain, most probable, that he will not pay you back, and he even thinks he's entitled to do so because he is dealing with a heretic. So in everyday contact, religious coherence matters very much in this for all economic, social affairs, and that's what people tried to avoid, and that's why religious choice remained or became just an option for the very few who were ready also to immigrate or to feel discrimination. Yes, now.
I'm curious about the image here. The Protestant minister is worshiping at a very simple looking pulpit. It has a little cornice, but nothing on it. Catholic priest has a fancier pulpit. Is there any distinction visible in the clothing that people are wearing about social class, or the prevalence of women as opposed to men? Or is there any distinction to be made at all? Possibly not, because an equal number of people might be Catholic and an equal number Protestant. But I was curious, I can't see this perfectly from where I'm sitting.
look at it here. So you might have a better look. But I would say no. Again, essentially, they are very similar. You might see that he's well nourished, and that's of course also part of this idea about the Catholic Church getting a lot of taxes and so on, which are spent. But after all, again, you do not get the impression that it's that there is a very clear distinction between the listeners. You could say they are look maybe a little bit more wealthy, but still they have furs on both sides. So
the book is very important.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The book.
The book. Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's important. Yeah, he's.
And his listeners are looking at him.
They're also reading.
The priests' listeners are looking else. Only one guy is looking at him.
Yeah, so the role of the word and the gospel and the Bible in it's yeah.
So there's a mother on the left with a book and the child. She's right in the middle on the left. She has a book on her lap, right? I can't see it, but
Well, no. I'm not sure, but it could be. But I'm not really sure whether it's a cloak. I must admit that I don't see it either. So we should do it together. So I think if you look closer to it, you of course have you discover distinctions, but the first impression is okay. It's not such if again compared to other pamphlets, it's not drastic. You first.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your formidable lecture. And going back to your remark that in 1550 the Bible was published in Denmark in the vernacular, and a few years later in Sweden, I was wondering what was the percentage of literate population in those countries in those years? And what was the percentage of literate population in Catholic countries at that time? Or when was the Bible translated into the vernacular in Catholic countries?
Yeah, I think for the 1550s, it's difficult, and I mean anybody may correct me, because if you say those countries, you're speaking about Scandinavia now, but. Yes. So the main difference is, of course, not so much north or south, or well, north or south to some extent, but not because of the climate or whatever. And in 1550, not necessarily Protestant and Catholic, but urbanized areas and rural areas. Since the Scandinavian countries have few cities, I guess it would be like 1 or 2% of people who knew how to read, which was much more in Italy, which was, of course, which remained Catholic. So you cannot say that there is, people who know to read become Protestant. But you didn't say that, but I just wanted to hint that in urbanized areas, but we have a special of urban history, so I hand it on. Maybe 10% in the cities in the German Empire.
In terms of literacy,
yeah.
Put it a little higher, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a diverse picture you get, depending on there are cities and cities.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm not sure there's a general answer to that.
It's difficult to say.
That will do for all.
But the change that happens is that there is a program of teaching which starts immediately in the Reformation. So in the 1520s and 1530s, you can see that teaching the vernacular, teaching all the boys in the cities as an idea, becomes very popular soon. The results depend, but you have a clear advantage of in literacy in the Protestant areas by the end of the 16th century. There is a difference in the as far as girls are concerned. and that's interesting that the Protestants tend to neglect girls' education, and whereas when especially the Jesuits are catching up, start to catch up in the late 16th and 17th century, and other religious communities in the Catholic world, they focus particularly on girls. So you would have maybe a better ratio on the for girls in Catholic in Catholic cities at least. But on the long run, well into the 19th century, the Protestant areas have more higher ratio of literacy than the Catholics.
Thank you.
And they go on longer. They remain longer in school. So it's not only about learning, but they stay in school.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. My question is mostly out of ignorance of 16th century Europe. How much after this moment of openness, or during this moment of openness, do the burghers wish to maintain some role in selection of ministers? I mean, do they want to stay involved? Once they've made the decision, we're going towards the Reformed, what we would call Lutheran trajectory, or stay within the Catholic fold, do they still want to have a part of the selection of the minister? Or does it revert back in the system to whether it goes Lutheran or Catholic to something like the investiture system, where the local duke is not going to listen and just appoint his brother or something? I mean, do they get a taste for this and still want to be a part of it?
Yeah, it's in a way the structure which is the overarching structure of the Catholic Church really breaks away in the Protestant era. So somebody has to do it, and you have to distinguish between the Lutheran and the Reformed ways, because in the Reformed, so Calvinists and Zwinglian, there it remains really the decisive body is the parish, and they go on, and they choose. In the Lutheran context, very often these are, you could call it networks, but I would rather say it's families. So it's inherited to some extent. If your father is a minister, you will become a minister yourself. Also for practical reasons. He teaches you from the beginning how to do. He is wealthy enough to send you to the university. There are some books and libraries. So we have all these dynasties of Protestant ministers for many generations, which means that it remains, it tends to be a club, but it's not a closed club. You can always, as a student, make your career, and you study theology, and then you are sent somewhere. It's essentially not the local, but in the Lutheran Church, the state which decides where you will be sent to.
I know that in the Catholic Church, it's relatively recent that they've started, well, relatively, I said like last 100 years that they've switched to doing the Mass in the vernacular. I know we've discussed about the Bible being translated, but at this time, were Protestant Masses also given in the vernacular, or was that still all done in Latin?
No. Well, it's not about, well, it's not the Mass, but the service, is it? Yeah. And but it's a focus again, as has been said. It's really the focus on the teaching and the reading from the Bible and the interpretation of the Bible, much more than the Latin Mass is insisting on the ritual, on the repetition of what everybody knows, and you don't even have to understand it because you just are used to doing it every Sunday.
So did that really make a difference? Did that make a difference to people, as saying, oh, I can, kind of follow these beliefs, and. Well,
we tend to do so, and I think if you really have this situation in the, let's say in the 1520s and 30s, and you have both, you are in the city and you have a priest and you have a minister, and you can see it that makes a difference, definitely. But very soon, again, you are just used to one type, and then you then it's so the market is closed again. I would say, but probably it's, you know, we would tend to say it's people would prefer a service where they understand what is told to them. Historically speaking, that was not the case. Many Catholics have been very happy Catholics. Maybe some are among us for centuries. And my wife, who is a Catholic, she always said, well, I never listened. She went to church every Sunday, as her uncle knows, and she never knew what she was told afterwards. She just liked standing up and sitting down and singing, and that was just so very normal. So it's maybe different ways of experiencing community, and it's not necessarily the better way when you are more involved, or not necessarily. So it can't. Of course, it depends on you, and not so much on as a general rule, maybe. Now the Catholics have to leave, have to hold up their hands.
I'm not,
it's immediate to that.
I wanted to say I'm not a Catholic, but it would seem like there is an extra burden if your salvation comes through understanding versus whether your salvation is coming through participation in a sacrament. So you could understand why someone might just prefer to be saved by a sacrament than to be told he has to understand what the Bible really means.
Although Luther would say he doesn't have to understand, he has to believe.
Okay,
but we would put it that way.
It's a burden.
Yeah. Roman, do you want to?
Well, I just meant to say I go back to the time when the Mass was read in Latin, and way before I had Latin in school, I understood, because every Sunday you heard it and you read it, and you had Latin, and then in my case the German translation on both languages side by side.
Yeah.
So after a while it just knew, even without having studied Latin yet.
Because the ritual was it was repeating, and it was not while he was saying something different tried to say something different every weekend. Yeah, there were two of you,
sorry.
but yeah, but
Go ahead.
I can wait, go ahead. You ask my question.
Or vice versa. I'll just very quickly, very struck by your quotes from Luther at the beginning, demonstrating his willingness to polarize and his belief that conflict and discord could be generative and positive. Those seem to me words that resonate in contemporary political spheres in America. And yet, those ideas, which come from the gospel, as you showed, don't seem to, it seems to me they don't resonate anywhere else. There's no precedent before Luther, it seems to me, outside the gospel for those ideas. Those are very radical and strange ideas, that conflict, discord, and extreme polarization could be a good thing. Right? So how did he convince people to follow him? How did he convince practical-minded citizens whose instincts would have been, as you were saying, always towards concord, compromise, negotiation, pragmatism? How did he convince them? And why was there not, this is too big a question, but why was there not a great compromiser? Somebody who came and said, look, I've got a way to reconcile. Let's be united again. Just how could that have not happened?
It is a big question. I will try to. That was not your question, so I may answer to it. Okay.
I'm really glad that I let this gentleman talk.
No, it's really more about this. It's more this is about discord.
I'm not sure whether you could say that was not the position of people before Luther. I think he's an exceptional case in insisting so much on distinctions
in the church.
in church.
But in civic politics, did anyone ever say that?
Okay.
Discourse-
Civic politics. But that was not actually his. I will come to that. I think that was not so much his point. In politics, he tended even to be not involved. Maybe, you know, he would have said, if I exaggerate a little bit, well, let Caesar, so Charles V, let the emperor kill us all. Since we know that we are right, he can do it. That's not because the real life is afterwards, and we cannot. We should not. He was against resistance in the beginning, against resistance against the emperor. So the political implications, and he, as you know, he was very harsh against the peasants in the Peasants' War, because he said, no, you have to suffer. This life is a suffering, and you. Do not think that the gospel is there for to free you on down on earth. While the answer to the question in general, there were compromises. Erasmus of Rotterdam, and there were people in close to Luther, like Melanchthon, who were quite ironic and who were trying to find ways with the Catholics and also within the Protestant movement. Luther, he was so antagonistic that he already with the Reformed and with many of his fellows in the beginning, he split up and they became enemies. So he was really polarizing a lot. But the answer, why would they? And would he insist so much on it? And why would people follow him? Because of truth. So we tend to say, well, peace matters more than truth, and survival is more important than Recht haben. What would it be? Keeping right? Being right. While if it's if it's really about truth, you are ready to die for it. People do that nowadays. We don't, but it's also because many of us, we wouldn't say that the question of salvation matters so much, and if it matters a lot to us, we would still be rather relativistic and say, well, we don't know whether the Holy God is a Catholic or a Protestant. We'd be rather cautious about that. We would not kill anybody to prove that the Almighty is a Catholic or a Protestant, and so on. But for many reasons, especially if you are in a social context where you depend much more on your fellows, and you want them to feel like you, and to feel like you, to believe like you, and to help you if you are suffering, and so on, then religious convictions play a big role. Now, that was already a comment to many things nowadays. I don't know whether it was a big enough question for answer for a very big question, but there's the next one.
Yeah, that one probably is going to be simple. I am just curious, you've mentioned that at some point in 1550s, a decision was made to allow the ruler, whether it's a kind of quote-unquote democratic city ruler or the local prince, to determine what the religion of the territory they control will be. And I'm just wondering whether there were any theological grounds for that found, or it was just a matter of kind of stalemate. They fought each other to a stalemate, and they got sick and tired simply of fighting. Because, I mean, clearly rulers were trying to get out of that arrangement because, you know, St. Bartholomew's Night, well after, you know, plenty of Protestants got killed. So I'm just curious whether there was anything theological about that arrangement, or it was just purely pragmatic, purely practical. You know, let's stop the bloodshed.
It was pragmatic. You could always find, and I'm sure I would have to check that. I'm sure you could say, well, in the Bible you find good reasons why you should not kill your next. problem is whether you really want to consider a Catholic being your next or a Protestant, vice versa. But the decision was pragmatic, and that becomes very clear in the text, where it's shown that it is provisional. So it's not a peace for to end the war forever. It is a truce, rather. In the logic of it lasted until the 30 Years' War, so it lasted for like 70 years. But the idea behind it was, okay, let's make a truce, and then we'll have a council general council, which was the case actually, the Tridentine Council, which was held then, and the idea was that that there would be a theological solution would be found at the council, but it was a pragmatic solution to no longer go on fighting among these German states, exactly to avoid the bloodshed. And everybody was convinced there cannot be two churches. There is one God. How could there be two churches, or three, or even more than that? So the need, the psychological, spiritual need for unity remained very large, but on the long run, the pragmatic solution imposed itself and imposed the rules that one said, okay, this has been established. The council didn't work out in the sense that there was a common understanding. And one of the results of the council's failure was, and as you mentioned, the French civil wars, which were somehow repeating, and on a even more drastically level, repeating what had happened in Germany before, and then the 30 Years' War in the 17th century again. And the lesson, when people started to understand that there could there would not be a reunion of a unified church again, the solution was to say, okay, the solution was that was not such a decision taken one day, but the solution is essentially Leviathan. So the state, Jean Baudin, the sovereign state, and Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, is the one who controls the church and must control the church to avoid civil war on religious grounds.
Well, I feel like we've been reenacting that image from the broadsheet. It's just that I don't have a lecture here, and I also have no counter argument, though I would have questions, but I can ask them later, as you can, because we still have time for a reception. So all I can say for my part is that hope you will join me in thanking our speaker, and you can ask any questions you have over wine and cheese.
Tomorrow is the midterm. Sorry for them.
No, it's really 8 a.m.
Yeah. No, luckily, I managed to not do any early morning classes. I don't know which deity I was trying to get that one, but I'm very happy.
Yeah.
It made me 3 times more productive.
Well, I don't know the long run also in
Yeah, well, I shouldn't be.
all those products, but they belong to them. They